I'm going to talk about a fairly deep dive into soil fertility, how fertilizer recommendations are developed, what I like about them, what I don't like about them, maybe some ideas to modify them to fit your management style, and then we'll finish it up with a few examples. So ready to roll? All right. So my challenge to you is to take ownership of how you're spending your fertilizer dollar. It just seems like a lot of people are pretty passive in this area. And if you discover what works best for your soils and your management, you will make more money. And so just real quickly, why do we soil test in the first place? We got to assess the soil, right? So, how variable is my field? Field variability, you really need to document that in order to come up with a good management plan. Is my pH optimized? What about my P and K soil test levels? Do I have micronutrient deficiencies? Now, soil tests are not the best thing in the world for identifying micronutrient deficiencies, but we are working on it to try to come up with something better. How variable are my soil test levels? If I'm from out west, then soluble salts can become a problem. So do I have any problem with soluble salts, right? Once I assess that soil, then I have to take that information, turn it into some kind of a management plan, right? So how much lime do I need if I'm applying lime? How much P and K do I need? Do I need to add micronutrients? What's my nitrogen strategy? Again, if you're out west, because I know we have a few folks from out west and maybe not in here, in this little group, but if you're out west and you have a salt problem, you need to add gypsum, right? I know it's more complicated than that because you got to assess your irrigation water quality as well. So you have to develop that nutrient management strategy. Well, you don't only soil test one time, right? So when you go back and soil test again, this is when you figure out, is my nutrient management strategy working, right? Did the lime I added get me to the pH that I was targeting? If I'm applying P and K, are my soil test levels headed to where I want them to go? So when it comes to soil testing and nutrient management, how many of you soil test? Okay. It's like I'm at a rock concert here. How often do you soil test? 4? 3? 2? Okay. How many of you use intensive grids or zones? Okay. How many of you use variable rate application for lime? Okay. P, K, nitrogen, right? How many of you use starter fertilizer? So, do you account for that when you're making your P and K application? Anybody not do that? I know you're lying. Okay. What happens, the way I look at it is, when you're developing your P and K budget, you're making your fall application, if you don't account for that starter fertilizer you're applying, you just kind of blow your budget out of the water. So I find this in nutrient management planning all the time. When I was at Purdue and we developed this nutrient management planning software, that was like the #1 issue, is that people would apply P and K because they think about it chronologically, and then they put on their starter, and so now they're applying more than they need, right? And my objective is to kind of get, if you're here, to get you to there, then get you to there, and then get you to there, right? So the idea is that find out what you need and then get to where you want to go. So how many of you intensively soil sample and then apply a straight rate of fertilizer that has nothing to do with your soil test results? And there's not a single hand going up. So I taught soil fertility at Purdue University for 26 years, and I would have my students do a nutrient management project from their farm or a relative's farm, and 50% of the people that were using intensive grid soil samples completely ignore the soil test results, and they put on 250 pounds of MAP or DAP and 250 pounds of potash. And so I've seen that, and so that's going to be something we're going to be addressing. So just want to introduce the concept of field mice, right? There's different types of field mice, right? There's skinny field mice, there's fat field mice, and there's fit field mice, okay? So if I was a skinny field mouse, what would my soil test phosphorus be? No answers. 0 to 5? So I would say less than 15, right? If you're less than 15 parts per million, you're probably riding on the edge. But I guess I would probably agree with you more and say 0 to 10, right? Potassium, less than 125 parts per million. Kind of depends on your soil, right? Sands can't really build up very high, but sandy soils maybe less than 80 to 100. Silt loam soils maybe 100 to 125. You're kind of on the edge of skinny to fit. So what's a fat field mouse soil test level for phosphorus? I think it's anything greater than 45 parts per million. How many of you have soil tests greater than 45 parts per million? Yeah, a lot of people, right? Potassium, greater than 225 parts per million. Anybody have that? You're lying. Okay. All right. So a fit field mouse, somewhere between, this is just my opinion, right? So you have your own opinions. I don't know what your management style is, but if I was considering, I would have my soil test level somewhere between 15 and 30 or 35 parts per million, and my ammonium acetate or my Malic 3K somewhere between 125 and 200 parts per million. And I'll explain to you why, y'all might think that's kind of low, but I'm trying to optimize ROI. I'm going to start a quick little demo here. We'll get to that later. Hope that works. I haven't tried it yet. So I want to talk about how you come up with fertilizer recommendations. How does the land-grant university come up with fertilizer recommendations, right? Because they didn't just pop out of thin air. So first you have to do field correlation trials. And you're looking at what is the yield of a crop at different soil test levels, right? And from that, when your yield goes up with your soil test, then it kind of flattens out, and it doesn't really matter if the soil test is any higher, your relative yield doesn't change. And somewhere around there is like your critical soil test level. And then there are other kind of concepts or approaches to making fertilizer recommendations where they say, it's really not a point, it's a range. And then you get an optimum class. Like, I'll show you some examples of that. And then you want to identify, what's a low soil test, what's a high soil test, what's a very high soil test, things like that. So this is what the results from a field correlation trial might look like. So on the horizontal axis, I have soil test phosphorus, okay, in parts per million. And then on the vertical axis, I have relative yield. So when my soil test is low, and I'm not applying any fertilizer to these soils, then my yield is low. And as my soil test goes up, yield goes up, and then it just kind of plateaus. And in this case, it plateaus about 30 parts per million. Okay, this is just made up stuff. And here's the same thing for potassium, right? Well, maybe I plateaued at 175 parts per million. Okay, now when I look at that, now I'm identifying at this soil test I don't get a response to applied fertilizer. But is that where I really want to be? That's not where I want to be. I want to be a little bit lower than that. Because if I'm going to be applying a maintenance rate of fertilizer, then I don't need to be at the level where that fertilizer is just a waste of time. I want to get some ROI on that. So the second thing that needs to be done is you do a calibration trial. And now you're looking at how much fertilizer do I need to add to optimize yield at different soil test levels, okay? So this is an example. So the black line that's going across the top of this graph is I've got a soil test level of 35 parts per million. And so on the horizontal axis, I have my application rate of phosphorus, and then on the vertical axis, I got my relative yield. So it doesn't matter whether I apply fertilizer or not, I get the same yield, right? So my rate would be 0 there. Now, let's say I'm at 25 parts per million. Well, I get a little bit of a yield boost to that first increment of fertilizer, but it just kind of shuts off. And so now I'm at 20 pounds, right? 20 pounds is less than crop removal, so I'm going to probably be back in my soil test level up. And then maybe at at a soil test of 15 parts per million, I get a response up to 50 pounds per acre. And when I start getting really low, like in that single digit, 5 part per million range, I have to put on a lot of fertilizer, and I still am not capping out my yield. And I believe that there are soil test levels, when you get low enough, you can't overcome that with a reasonable amount of fertilizer. And here's the same thing for potassium, right? Exact same situation, right? We're just looking at a different nutrient. So that's theoretically what it looks like, okay? So this is the theoretical graph of a crop response trial. This is what it actually looks like, okay? This is from Iowa. We're looking at soil test potassium. So this is a dried soil test potassium in parts per million on the horizontal axis and relative yield on the y-axis. That doesn't really look very clean, right? So now you're trying to come up with, well, where do I draw the line? So Iowa doesn't draw a line. They just kind of break it into categories. I'll show you that in a little bit. Now, one thing that really improves that relationship, doesn't make it super pretty, but at least it looks a little bit more like a hockey stick, is if you analyze that soil sample moist. And there's something else here. Look at on that center graph, the solid black lines. They're mostly on the high end of the soil test, right? But if you don't dry the soil, the black lines shift way over, and they're among the lowest testing. Okay? And overall, the whole pattern starts at a lower soil test level. Okay? So drying has a big impact on soil test potassium. And the reason for that, first I'll just show you, this is some data from Iowa, because Iowa is the only state that has an interpretation for a moist K test. So on the x-axis, this is your moist soil test K. Okay? On the vertical axis, it's the dry soil test K divided by the moist soil test K. So if the number is 2, that means that when I dry the soil, I double my soil test level. Okay? And you can see the lower you get, the bigger the increase. The lower your soil test gets when it's moist, the higher it gets when it's dry. Now, it doesn't happen all the time, because if you look down there at about 100 to 200 parts per million, you'll see a lot of dots that are less than 1. And that means when I dry the soil test goes down. Okay? So Iowa has an interpretation of the way they interpret it. They just kind of took about the average, and they say a dry soil test K is about double a moist soil test K. So if you ever look at PM 1688, that's the Iowa State, fertilizer recommendation bulletin, that's how it's interpreted. But you can see that soils are all over the place on how they respond. And the reason for that is clay mineralogy. So this is an electron micrograph of clay minerals, right? So there's that kind of solid stuff that's going horizontally across the picture there. That is what we'd call like an illite clay mineral. And so, clay minerals, I think of clay minerals just like a notebook, or like the notepad you have right there. And so it's just layers and layers and layers. Now, if you drop that in water, it's going to soak up, pages, kind of expand, and everything just kind of unravels. And that's what that mare's tail, that's kind of leaning down into that lower right quadrant of that picture. Well, that's a smectite. Okay, that's an expanding, that when potassium comes out of the inner layer of that solid one, that illite, the pages unravel, and then it becomes smectite. And so when you add fertilizer, then that potassium can go in between those clay layers, and then when you dry it, they can shut, and if they shut pretty fast, then that potassium becomes higher in the exchangeable potassium soil test. But it doesn't always happen. So potassium soil testing is just really challenging. The reason a moist soil sample is better is, if you kind of think about it, if your soil test goes up when it's low, when you dry it, and then when the soil test levels are high, it goes down. That means you're artificially making the low soil test higher and the high soil test lower. So now you don't have a very steep line to make an interpretation. So this is kind of that data that I was showing you before, right? So when you dry the soil, it gets messier. And the reason for that is that kind of salmon-colored thing on the pie chart is the amount of smectite, right? So the more smectite you have in your clay, the more the soil test will change when you dry it. And so let me do a little more interpretation about this. So we have well-drained soils on the left, poorly drained soils on the right. And then on the horizontal axis. And on the vertical axis, we have the extracted potassium increase over field moist soil depending on how you dry it. Okay, so if you think about commercial labs, different labs dry at different temperatures. Okay, and so those bars, when you have a 50% increase, if it's 100, that means that the soil test doubled upon drying. But the difference between that white, gray, and black bar underneath each one of those pie charts is how much does it change based on the drying temperature, right? So that's why if you send, your sample to one lab, you're going to get one potassium number. If another lab uses a different drying method, you're going to get a different number. Well, plants don't dry, or they don't grow in oven-dried soils. So you get a better relationship when you're analyzing the soil moist than you do when you analyze the soil dry. And that's kind of why with the Radicle lab, we have the ability to analyze a moist sample, and that's our preferred way of analyzing it. Okay, there's other things you can learn from crop response trials. So I got this from John Jones at the University of Illinois. So this is like plant tissue K concentrations versus grain yield. I don't know how you interpret that. It's even worse than the crop response trials because there's a lot of luxury uptake of potassium by corn, not so much with soybean at that particular growth stage. Another thing you can learn is, this is from the greenhouse trials that we're conducting. This is just a small smattering of data here. But if you look at this graph, on the right side of the graph is where we're adding fertilizer and incubating the soil. And then on the left side, where the numbers are negative, that's where we're taking that soil, supplying it with everything it needs except for potassium, and then cropping it out and looking at the soil test changes with crop removal. And the slope of those lines are what's called the buffer capacity, right? It's the inverse slope of this, but still it's the slope. So the greater the slope, the greater the buffer capacity. That means I have to add more potassium to change my soil test compared to something with a lower slope, which means I don't have to add as much potassium. Like, is it 4 pounds of K2O or is it 8 pounds of K2O to get a 1 ppm change in soil test level? The other things that from this graph is that you can see not all soils have the same slope, and every one of these, when you start going into the negative, the slope kind of flattens out. So that means that the buffer capacity of a soil for potassium, and this is also true for phosphorus, is dependent on the soil test level. Now, almost every state says all soils have the same buffer capacity across all soil test ranges. Okay? It's not true. And the other thing that we found is where that slope change really occurs, that's where we find the critical soil test level as far as the plants becoming potassium deficient. So we're going to use this, and all of these soils that are here are part of our crop response trials. So we also have what's going on in the field, but we can look in the controlled environment and see what's going on in the greenhouse. So this should help us. Okay, enough about kind of how recommendations are made. Once you collect all the data, right, you have to come up with, well, how do I interpret that and come up with recommendations? So there's a buildup and maintenance approach that's used across the Midwest, not universally, and I'll show you some examples of that. The idea with the buildup and maintenance is that you increase your soil test to a non-limiting level, and then you maintain it there with regular fertilizer additions. Okay? There's also a sufficiency-based approach. The sufficiency-based approach says, I don't know, tell me what your soil test level is. I'll tell you what percent of the nutrients can be supplied by the soil, and I'm just going to add exactly what I need to maximize yield this year. I'll work on next year. And then there's a lot of hybrid approaches. Iowa has a hybrid approach. Wisconsin has a hybrid approach. You kind of, if your soil test is low, you're going to apply more fertilizer than crop removal. So the soil test is going to increase, but it's not going to increase in a specific period of time like a true buildup and maintenance approach is. So let me just show you an example of these, right? So this is University of Illinois P fertilizer recommendations for 215 bushel per acre corn, and this is on, Illinois breaks their soils into 3 classes: high subsoil P, medium subsoil P, low subsoil P. So I'm just taking the low subsoil P example here, okay? So this is what that recommendation system looks like. So right here, and so on the horizontal axis is your soil test level, on the vertical axis is your application rate. So where those two, the flat line and the slope line intersect is generally what is referred to as the critical soil test level. If you're below that critical soil test level, then you're going to be in the buildup range. Well, I'll get to that in a second. You see that plateau there where the soil test goes from 25 to 35 parts per million, but the rate remains the same, okay? And then at 35 parts per million, it just plummets to 0. Okay, so the idea here is that the idea of nutrient banking is something that doesn't have a real long lifespan, okay? Banking nutrients is a negative interest-bearing account. I'm going to hopefully I'll have a little demo of that, all right? And then between that critical soil test level and the maintenance limit, you have the same fertilizer recommendation. So this is called the maintenance range. And that rate at the maintenance range is usually your crop removal rate. Now, if you're below that critical soil test level, the idea of a buildup is to go from wherever you're at to the critical soil test level in a specified period of time. In Illinois, it's 4 years. That's pretty common in the Midwest. And so this is called the buildup range. So you have your maintenance rate, which is crop removal, and then the lower your soil test, the more additional fertilizer you're applying because you want to increase your soil test to the critical soil test level. And what drives the slope of that line is 1, how many years are you going to take to get there? And 2, the buffer capacity of that soil. How much P do you need to add to get a 1 ppm change in soil test level? Okay? So that's the buildup and maintenance approach. The sufficiency-based approach, this is an example from Kansas. So the sufficiency-based approach in Kansas, what they're finding is that at 20 parts per million, there's no response to applied fertilizer. So once you hit 20 parts per million, the recommendation goes to 0. Now, if you're below that, then you're not trying to build up the soil, you're just trying to apply the amount of fertilizer that soil needs to maximize yields this year. I love this in theory, but I don't love it in reality, because your rate is obviously just designed to maximize yield. But if you look at this and you look at crop removal, if you followed that recommendation, you would have a soil test phosphorus of 4 parts per million. And I don't think you can get full yields at 4 parts per million by putting on 75 pounds of P2O5. I just don't think that's reality. So there's a big difference in cost here as well, right? So I'm using MAP at $810 per ton, and I'm forgetting about the value of the nitrogen. And the difference between a buildup and a sufficiency example between Illinois, which is basically the highest, and Kansas, which is basically the lowest, it's $80 per acre if you're below the critical soil test value. And then once you hit that critical soil test value, it's still a $60 per acre difference, right? So most states only support 1 recommendation system. Kansas actually supports 2. Okay, there's the Kansas buildup, and the Kansas sufficiency one is in orange, and their buildup is in red. Now, they don't have a maintenance range, right? So if you look at, where you're at 75 pounds per acre fertilizer rate, that's about crop removal. So in Kansas, they're basically telling you that we're going to build your soil test level up to about 19, 20 parts per million, and then you're going to keep it there. If you're below that, the buildup will get you there. If you're above that level, then the reduced rate will get you back there, okay? And really, you want to make sure that if you're doing a 4-year sampling plan, that slope will change, right? Because if you followed a recommendation for 6 years for a 4-year buildup plan, the soil test level could very well be below where you want it. And so it's really important to understand the intricacies of these recommendation systems. Okay, so there's a lot of different types of approaches to making recommendations. So it looks like pickup sticks to me, right? I'll show you, this is what all of the recommendation systems in the Midwest look like, okay? So if nobody's wrong, that means there's a lot of ways to be right. And so no state is intentionally going to tell a farmer to follow their recommendations and risk yield loss, right? I mean, it's just not going to happen. Now, there's differences in approaches, and there's differences in soils and climate and all of those things that all factors into it, but this is a pretty darn big spread of data. Build-up and maintenance and sufficiency examples, that was a big smattering of data. I'm just going to break it down. So here's the Illinois build-up and maintenance. Here's the Kansas State sufficiency-based approach. And then here are hybrid approaches. These are used in Iowa and Wisconsin. So it's a stair step. So they break the soil test levels into classes, right? And as soon as when you're low, you're going to be putting on more than crop removal, and then eventually you're putting on less than crop removal. So those categories have meanings, right? So basically, when you have a really high soil test level, you shouldn't get a response to applied nutrients. And if you have a very low soil test level, you absolutely are going to have a response to applied nutrients. And so they break it down and they say, at a given soil test level, how much is the soil supplying? How much do I need to add in fertilizer? Well, that's cool. It's the risk, right? What percentage of the time you're going to get a crop response? But you also have to look at, am I making money by fertilizing, right? So this is from Antonio Malorino at Iowa State. They've done tons and tons of crop response trials with both corn and soybeans. And so here you have 3 different panels. They're all the soil test level going on the horizontal axis, and then net returns to phosphorus, kind of like the MRTN for nitrogen, but what's your net return on fertilizing? So you can see, and it's in dollars per acre, when the price of corn and beans is high, then your soil test levels are lower, you get a huge, huge boost in ROI. When the price plummets, the boost you're getting goes way down. And so at some point, you're at 0. Now, if I'm a farmer and I've got a 10% chance of getting a yield increase with applied fertilizer, I'm applying it. Okay? I'm not a risk taker, but I'm also not just blindly approaching this. So here's the example for Iowa. Iowa just updated their fertilizer recommendations. So these are the very low, low, optimum, high, very high classes that they had up until 2022, I think. And on this next panel, you can see on the bottom, they're the new classes. And what they've done is they've shifted everything over. And the reason that they shifted things over, one, is assessing soil test variability is just not done very well for the most part by us, right? I mean, we really don't have a whole lot of confidence that we are assessing the variability in the field. And the other component of this is that they started doing some lab comparisons just like we've been doing here, and they find out that, wow, soil tests, different labs give different results. And so they said the safe thing to do is just bump everything up. Okay, that's the premise of it. And then here's their probability of crop response to applied fertilizer at different soil test categories, right? So if you're very low, you've got a really high crop response probability. When it's very high, you have essentially none. And then you kind of decide where you want to be in there. Okay, so critical soil test phosphorus values, regardless of how messy this looks, where the fertilizer recommendation goes to crop removal or something close to that, occurs at 15 to 25 parts per million, pretty much regardless of state. So that means there's not a big wide range, even though these all look different. They're not interpreting the soils that much different. It's just that their rate recommendations are different. And nobody makes a fertilizer recommendation above 35 parts per million. One cool thing about that, I found this is also from Antonio. I did this when I was at Purdue. I found the exact same thing, is if you're in that agronomic optimum soil test range, and I would just say if you're less than 40 parts per million, is what I found at Purdue, the amount of soluble P and the potential for P loss is basically, kind of baseline. It's when you get above 40 parts per million, that's when soluble phosphorus starts to increase, and that's when you start getting off-site, loss risk. And I'm sure all of you are dealing with a phosphorus index of some kind. Okay, just so you know, potassium fertilizer recommendations aren't any better. Okay, this is pickup sticks for potassium. But nobody's making a recommendation greater than 200 parts per million in the Midwest. Critical soil test values are 100 to 160 parts per million for all states. So that should kind of give you an idea of well, where should I be going with my soil tests? I don't like the buildup and maintenance system because it doesn't speak precision fertility to me. Why would I apply the same rate of phosphorus at 25 parts per million as I would at 35 parts per million? If 25 parts per million is the critical soil test value and that's your target, then if I'm starting at a higher soil test level, why am I not going back to 25 parts per million? That just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't speak precision fertility, and I'll show you an example, several examples here in a minute. Okay? I like the concept of a targeted soil test-based system. So I've got the tri-state recommendations in blue and the Illinois recommendations in black, right? So the idea here is that we are encompassing critical soil test values of 15 parts per million up to 25 parts per million, right? That's where the lines flatten out, right? 25 parts per million for Illinois, 15 parts per million for the tri-state. So if I'm risk averse, then I would make my target soil test be 25 parts per million. Now, when I get there, what am I doing? I'm applying crop removal. So if I have a risk of a crop response if I don't apply fertilizer, I'm applying fertilizer. I don't have any risk, right? If I'm more of a risk taker, tri-state, our research at Purdue and Ohio and Michigan showed, basically at 15 parts per million, you've got maybe a 20% chance of getting crop response to applied fertilizer. Well, if you're applying the fertilizer and you're applying crop removal, you've eliminated that risk. Now, if I'm a moderate risk taker, well, maybe I'll have my target be at 20 parts per million. The idea of increasing your soil test and just keep doing it, I mean, there's a huge farmer in Illinois that rents a lot of ground, and he shared his soil test levels with me, and phosphorus went from about 10 parts per million up to about 80 parts per million. Potassium went from 80 parts per million up to 500 parts per million. The only difference was how long that guy was managing that field, because he grid soil samples very intensively and ignores it and just puts on a straight rate of fertilizer on every acre because it's easy. And so the idea of doing that is like you are wasting money, and you cannot put a bunch of fertilizer in, make that deposit. I've seen lots of deposits. I've seen very few withdrawals, right? So you just have to decide where you are on the risk aversion scale and then target where you want to be and come up with a plan to get there. I'm not going to tell you what soil test level you should have, but I would get rid of the maintenance range, right? Like say I'm in Illinois and it's like, well, I'm not comfortable at 25 parts per million, so I'll have my target soil test level at 30 parts per million. Great, do that, right? If I'm like, I know I'm applying fertilizer, I know I can be at 15 parts per million and get full yield, great, do that. But the only way you're going to really know is if you do crop response trials on your own farm. And you're going to hear about that from some of the other speakers today. All right. Now, phosphorus is especially phosphorus, but also potassium. These nutrients are delivered to the plant via diffusion, okay? So that means that, especially for phosphorus, the concentration of phosphorus in the soil solution is almost always less than 1/10 of a part per million. And if a plant takes up, 6 million pounds of water, you know, let's just say 10 million pounds of water, at 1/10 of a part per million, that's a pound, right? It's a pound of phosphorus that is taken up. So it actually gets delivered via diffusion. And so the concentration is really low because the soil holds on to phosphorus pretty tightly. And so it's just the ability of that soil to keep releasing phosphorus when the plant takes it out of solution. That's what's important, not the concentration. And so here's a corn plant. And I'm just zooming in, pretending like I'm zooming into a root hair. And these are all soil particles. And I'm in a saturated soil. Phosphorus can only reach that plant root through water. Okay? And so if I have a saturated soil, then that phosphorus can jump off that soil particle and go straight across, right? This is awesome for phosphorus delivery. Well, it's really not, but if you were growing rice, you could maybe do this, but you can't do this with corn because the corn will drown, right? But if you're in a moist soil, then what happens is you start getting air pocket, right? Well, plants need that. And so, but now there's air gaps in the system, so when phosphorus gets delivered to a plant root, it can't take a straight line. It's got to take a more tortuous path. It's got to go around those air pockets. And as you dry the soil more and more, well, then you can have an air gap that will prevent the soil particles from delivering phosphorus to that plant root. So what I did there is all of those yellow soil particles, there's an air gap where those X's are, and so there's no way for the phosphorus from those soil particles to get to the plant root because there's an air gap. And so the way I think about that is if I'm in a drier soil environment, well, what I want to do is I want to make sure that if I'm in a dry soil environment, I have a higher concentration of phosphorus per soil particle. So I'm going to have a higher soil test in a dry environment than I am in a more moist environment. You know? And so what's my water holding capacity? What's my topography? You know, be thinking about that kind of stuff. Okay, so here's an example. This is a quarter section. It's a square quarter section. There are not a lot of those around, but it's easy for demonstration purposes. It's 2.5 acre gridded soil samples. You're going to hear nothing but bashing about 2.5 acre grids from all the other presentations, and I do agree with them. It's just this makes it easy to visualize. And so I just bought this piece of ground. It's been managed, not super highly managed, but it's been managed with a straight rate of fertilizer. The blue area of that field in the upper right corner is basically coming down to a stream, and it's pretty flat and it's flood prone and things like that. The red area in the lower left is an eroded knob, okay? I know I'm really oversimplifying things here, but as a result of applying uniform rates, but I have lower yields in the dry area and lower yields in the wet area, my soil test in those areas increased, right? If I look at the overall average soil test from each one of those grids, you know, take them and average them as 26 parts per million, but it's much higher in the wet area than it is in the dry area. So I got this land, what am I going to do with it? So again, I've got, you know, my MAP price at $800 a ton, and I'm going to use the University of Illinois fertilizer recommendations. So if my soil test level is less than 25 parts per million, I'm going to build it up to 25 parts per million because that's the critical soil test level. If my soil test level is greater than 35 parts per million, it's going to draw it down to 35 parts per million because that's the maintenance limit. Any soil test between 25 and 35 is going to stay the same. So in theory, if I follow that recommendation, this is what my field will look like. I don't have any soil tests more than 35 parts per million. I don't have any soil tests less than 25 parts per million. But I do have soil tests between those two values. So that's going to cost me $15 per acre or $2,400 for this field. Well, let's say that I'm just going with 25 parts per million. I'm going to build up to the critical level, draw down to that critical level according to Illinois. So my whole field becomes 25 parts per million. That's going to save me $3.50 an acre, $560 per field. And because the University of Illinois recommendations actually cost me $2,400, I'm saving, relative to the University of Illinois recs, almost $3,000 on that field. Now let's say that we have done some research and we find out that the lower areas, you can have 15 parts per million. The drier areas, yes, that's where you want 25 parts per million, but kind of in the green area, you only need 20 parts per million. So now, that's what my field would turn into. And I look at that and I'm thinking, well, that looks a little bit more like, precision soil fertility to me. And the other thing is, I'm saving $21 an acre, $3,360 per field. It's almost $6,000 left than the University of Illinois. And you're still doing the same thing, right? Pick the soil test level that you want and figure out a way to get there. Don't be beholden to the land-grant university recommendations or any recommendation system that puts a whole lot of slop in that system, right? Maybe the sloppier I'm going to say sloppy, the less intensive your soil sampling, probably the higher you want your target soil test levels, just because you don't want to leave any of the, the skinny mouse areas of the field to be deficient, right? So back to the field mice types. So here's a skinny mouse field. I had a neighbor lady that found out what I did for a living, and she rents her land, completely disconnected from agriculture, but lives in West Lafayette. And she said, Brad, could you look at my soil test results? My renter passed away, and for the past several years, our yields have just been going down. And I said, well, yes, show me your soil test. Well, I looked at them, single-digit phosphorus, potassium 40 to 60 parts per million. And I said, I'm sorry that he died, but if he was alive, what I'm about to tell you would make you want to kill him. He just mined that soil. And so here's an example of a mined out soil, right? Not super low, but it's a skinny mouse field, 12 parts per million average soil test level. So if I'm going to use the University of Illinois, everything's below 25, that field's going to become 25 parts per million. It's going to cost me $45.50 an acre, $7,300 for that field. If I go to 15, 20, and 25 part per million target soil test levels, well, that's going to only cost me $28 a field. So I'm going to save $28 an acre, $44.80 for the field. It's $2,800 less than the University of Illinois. And let's say that, well, I like to be higher. So instead of 15, 20, 25, I'm going to go 20, 25, and 30, all right? That basically is the same as the University of Illinois, because some up in the upper right-hand corner, it's 20. In the lower left, it's 30. It's pretty close to 25 average, so it costs about the same. But it looks more like precision soil fertility, right? Here's a fat mouse field, okay? Remember, there's a fit mouse inside every fat mouse, and I'm living proof of it. Winter conference, I'm going to be a little more of a fit mouse. That's my goal, all right? So we have this fat mouse field. Soil test values, 45 parts per million on average, right? Well, the cost of different recommendation strategies here, University of Illinois, what are you going to do? Everything's over 35 parts per million. My field is going to become 35 parts per million. I'm going to save $35 an acre, $5,600 a field by doing that, just dropping it to 35. If I go to the 15, 20, 25 part per million target soil test, well, now I'm going to save 88 bucks an acre. It's $8,400 less than following the University of Illinois fertilizer recommendation. Even if I go with the 20, 25, 30, okay, I'm saving 70 bucks an acre. It's still $5,600 less than the University of Illinois. It's by saying, what is the soil test level that I want, and then going there and staying there, right? And that's what I want you to be thinking about doing. Okay, so my challenge to you, again, is take ownership. You know how Matt was saying, well, what seat in the bus are you going to occupy? You should either be driving the bus or telling the driver where you want him to go, right? You should have these conversations. You should really consider doing some, crop response trials on your farm. We'll show you how to do it. We'll hold your hand all the way through the process, right? But if you figure out what works best for your field, you will increase the ROI on that fertilizer dollar. Okay, so real quick, so here's this. It's pretty funny because I did this and it didn't work. It kind of works. All right, can you all see that this has a blue tint to it? No, you probably can't. Let's see. Yeah, you can see it? Okay, so this is my thing about nutrient banking. Phosphorus concentrations in the soil are very low. And when you apply phosphorus fertilizer, it's really binding up primarily with iron and aluminum oxides on the surface, okay? And then the plant is extracting it back off. So what you're doing is you have a high concentration of phosphorus on the surface, and the plant removes it from the solution. It's a really short jump for that to get into the water. Now, if you're banking your soil and you've built your soil test levels up to 50, 60 parts per million, now over a period of years, if you just think of these little balls as soil particles, that phosphorus, there's a lot of iron and aluminum inside there, and that phosphorus is just kind of migrating in. And now you have, at the surface, you have a lot of phosphorus, not a lot of iron and aluminum. But as it starts to get pulled in, now there's more iron and aluminum surrounding that phosphorus, and it'll just keep migrating in. And now, when you try to make a withdrawal from the bank, it's in there, but it's not coming out fast enough. So you can't make the withdrawal like you think you can. I understand the concept of burying money, to hide it from the tax man, but I really think there's better places to spend it because it's a negative interest bearing account, right? You're not going to be able to withdraw what you put in, and you're not gaining any interest on it either. I mean, having a couple years worth of banking, I don't have any problems with that, right? If you want to go from 20 to 25 parts per million, that's fine, no problem. But don't get up to 50 parts per million. You're never going to get that money back. So anyway, any questions? I've got 37 seconds. Yes, Larry.
Wet, moist sample versus dry sample. What's the difference? I mean, I understand when it's moist, but how moist and how dry? When do they separate into one category or the other?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Larry's asking, okay, you talk about a moist sample. Well, what if I have a really wet sample versus a sample that I pulled from the soil when it was pretty dry? Antonio Malorino did a study on that, and there's no effect of how moist the soil is. It's just the fact that it's not been dried. Okay, so as long as it hasn't been dried in an oven or completely air dried, I mean, the surface soil, that'll be air dried, right? But there's still moisture wicking up through there, so it's never really air dry because the water is moving up, so the soil does have moisture in it. But if you stick it out, pull it out, and spread it out, then it will become air dry, and that's when your soil test levels change. So it doesn't matter if it's a moist soil, when you're pulling a sample, whether it's a moist soil or a fairly dry soil, it's still a moist soil, and the soil test value doesn't change with the amount of moisture in the soil when you pull a sample? That's an awesome question. I almost put that data slide in there, but I didn't. All right.
Sure.
I am out of time.
One more quick round.
Yep.
So what do you say to the guy that has a field that's next to the barn that's been having manure on it for the last 30 years? He's got an 80 spray one, and he's raising 300 bushel corn.
Yeah. Then a fan of zero fertilizer recommendation. I'd be putting on starter P or something like that. Just because our soil tests are really developed for assessing soils that are being regularly fertilized. Now, the reason I say that is Stan Barber at Purdue did some work in Indiana, and so he built up these soils to pretty high levels, and then he just quit fertilizing them altogether for 10 years. And the plants actually became deficient at a higher soil test level than they did, than they would at, if you were mining down from, say, 40 parts per million, you can get down to 15, but if you're at 60 or 80, it would go deficient at 30 or 35 parts per million. And the reason is you're not priming the system. You're allowing that diffusion to keep going in this way, and you're not putting anything on the surface so the plant has access to it. So I am not a big proponent of a zero fertilizer recommendation strategy. That would be my answer. But it's like, yeah, you're growing 300 bushel per acre corn. You're also putting manure on. I mean, when I was at Purdue, some of my colleagues would always say, when I think of crap, I think of you, Brad, because I was the crapologist at Purdue. I did a lot of the manure management planning. And if you manage manure well, you will beat the yields that you can get with commercial fertilizer. The problem with manure is that, pigs aren't like a tube of toothpaste. You just can't squeeze out that manure when you want. When the pit's full, you're going to haul. And a lot of times you're going to compact the bejesus out of the soil, and your timing isn't good, so you don't have that control. But if you control it, like the eggheads at the university do, well, then you can show that you're going to do a better job. But that guy could be raising just as good a corn, putting manure on at 25 or 30 parts per million as he could at 80. I mean, it's kind of one of those things where, yeah, that's what I'm doing, and I'm doing great, but you could probably do it for a lot less. These guys that are winning these yield contests, it's not like they're throwing the kitchen sink in the field. They've got a strategy. They've got micronutrient strategy and things like that.